Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is MIKKEL Thorpe, and this is the Expat Money Show. Today's guest is a freedom maximalist and privacy advocate. He is the head of strategy and content for Foundation Devices, which builds Bitcoin-centric tools that empower you to reclaim your freedom. He also serves as the editor for Freedom Tech, a global hub championing Bitcoin builders, open source developers, educators, and privacy tech pioneers. Please welcome to the show, Seth for Privacy. Seth, how are you?
Doing really well today, MIKKEL. Thank you so much for having me on. Always excited to talk about really freedom tech generally as a concept and how all this stuff is really just to serve one purpose, which is making individual freedom easier.
Well, amazing. And I think it is a super relevant conversation for everything that we're seeing in the world. Super important conversation for today. But let's kind of start a little bit about your backstory. How did you get so interested in privacy and specifically the privacy on the technology front?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to start. And for me, my life kind of did a 180. I'm not like one of those kind of stereotypical cypherpunks or hackers that was always very technologically savvy, had a deep passion and a deep ethos in this space, but rather really just liked technology, always kind of an enthusiast, nothing crazy, building gaming PCs, that sort of thing. So I like technology, no real vision for how it could help human freedom or a need for technology that enabled human freedom. My background is in cybersecurity, so obviously a little bit of touching on the concepts of privacy, but from the perspective of actually essentially spying on employees of my company and other companies. It's part of the job. Obviously, there's a clear need for cybersecurity within companies, so I don't think it's the same as like government surveillance, but kind of started on the opposite end of the spectrum in that I was building technology and deploying tools that actually helped to break user privacy within a company so we could make sure that nothing bad was happening. Again, no vision for why privacy mattered at that time, but really just started kind of thinking about what were the implications of the technology that I was building and enabling. I was at a massive IT company, mostly focused in cybersecurity. There were rumors of them essentially catering to the Chinese government, helping with the Uyghur genocide with the technology that I wasn't directly working on, but that my company was actually deploying. And it really shook me because I had never considered the fact that the things that I was doing for a large corporation could be actually used to oppress humans. I obviously wasn't thinking about how it was enabling human freedom either, but I also hadn't looked at the flip side. So I really kind of stepped back, took stock of what I was doing. At the same time, I picked up Edward Snowden's latest book. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, and just happened to decide to read it. Saw it at a bookstore. And the connection between those two things really just made me shift the direction of my career path, the direction of my interests, 180 degrees. At that point, I already gotten interested in Bitcoin and Monero, which is a more privacy preserving cryptocurrency. So I had like a vague inkling of it, but really the thing that changed for me was I realized that many companies were actually using technology to enslave people or to reduce their freedoms, but that there was this group of people, cypherpunks generally, who were building technology that really could change things, that could allow the individual to fight back against corporations that were trying to abuse their technology, against governments. And it really made me shift things. That's why I started working in the Bitcoin space. That's why I started my own podcast a few years ago. I really wanted to find ways that I could kind of start to right some of the wrongs that I had loosely contributed to through my kind of career past, and find a niche where I could contribute to the space. I'm not a developer, but someone who I think breaks down technical concepts well for new users. So I wanted to find a niche for that.
Amazing. So a lot of this really was moral understanding of the work that you were on. And then at some point realizing that you needed to make a change in your life. Because I mean, when we look at a lot of the technology that's happening in the world, and we're talking about actually developing and working on this technology, it's not enough to just kind of bury your head in the sand and go, well, it's not applicable to me, or it's not my responsibility, or anything like that. I have a very dear friend of mine, Paul Rosenberg, who's actually been on this show, very good friend for many years. And I remember him talking to me on one occasion and sending out some information, like making a call to arms for everybody in the technology space and saying, don't be working on CBDCs. Don't be working on government surveillance and things like this. we understand it's golden handcuffs and we understand that they are paying well to do these types of things, but you're actually enslaving humanity, and you need to take moral stock of what you're doing. And there's other ways to work. There's other ways to earn money and have a career. So be very careful about what you're doing. And when he said that, it was really an eye-opening experience. Like, I'm certainly not a developer. I don't have a technology background, but I was like, yes, you are right. Like, you are 100% right. You need to be very careful about the projects that you're working on, because it does affect other human beings.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's interesting you mentioned Paul Rosenberg, because when I really started this journey, I had started really thinking deeply about Bitcoin and starting to get involved in the space. One of the first conferences I went to was Hackers Congress in Pereloni Polis, which is in Prague. Paul was speaking there, and his presentation, and one by Mitch Altman, who's essentially the creator of the idea of a hacker space. They both talked a lot about this concept, about how your work is not just a paycheck. Your work is not just, okay, yes, I work for a corporation and maybe they're doing bad things, but I'm doing some good over here. Your work is essentially your legacy. It's what you're going to contribute to mankind. For most people, you're going to work 40 plus hours a week. You're going to spend 40 years of your life working. You have to think about it differently than what I think was the common perspective, at least in the West. I'm American, so obviously I'll be speaking more from an American perspective. But for us, for years, it's been, you just find a good, stable job. If you get a good paycheck, you do whatever it takes. Obviously, you try not to do things that are immoral or bad, but if you're not explicitly contributing to it, you just you hunker down, you do your part. Like you said, it's not my responsibility, or it's not my job, or that's not my team doing that. And you just live your life. But I think, thankfully, there has been a shift, and people like Paul are really instrumental in that shift, and talking to those who understand that they have some unique skills that actually contribute to the space and that actually can change things, and helping us to wake up and finally understand that we can't just dedicate our lives to a paycheck and then maybe some side projects, but we may actually have to sacrifice easy financial security or find alternate ways to get financial security and do things that really make the world a better place using the unique skills that we have. That doesn't mean you have to suddenly become a developer if you're non-technical, or if you're a developer and you think education is the thing, but it's not your kind of skill set to jump that way. But everyone has a background that coalesces into a unique skill set that really can contribute to enabling human freedom in unique ways that I think most people don't really realize.
Very well said. So talk to me then a little bit about the things that you're working on today, where you are moving the needle on the other side, where you are helping to contribute to freedom for individuals, opposed to working on projects that didn't sit well with you.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I started originally that I haven't done much recently was a podcast called Opt Out, which really just gave me the chance to start to pick brilliant people's brains, to start to understand why privacy projects like Signal, like Tor, security tools like Bitwarden, why a lot of free and open source projects were so vital, to better understand their approach, their perspective. And that helped me to get a better idea of where I wanted to go with kind of my skill set. And thankfully, back in, I guess it was now 2021, I jumped in, or no, 2022. I got the opportunity to jump in and join a company in the Bitcoin space, but really kind of broadly in the freedom tech space, starting with Bitcoin as kind of the core of what we do, called Foundation Devices. I joined them in October of 2022. And my role there is really broad strategy and education. Obviously, some of that involves marketing, but the way that I saw myself fitting in is Foundation's core focus, like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, is Bitcoin-centric freedom tech. That doesn't mean that everything we will build is Bitcoin only or Bitcoin specific. I think pretty much everybody on the team agrees that Bitcoin is a core technology to enabling human freedom, but it is not everything that we need. And I think there can be some ideas within the Bitcoin community that all we need is Bitcoin. It's going to fix everything. Don't worry about any other technology, any other privacy, anything like that. Just let Bitcoin fix money, and then we'll just move on. But when you actually talk to people who are actually fighting back today, they need a lot of tools. Yes, obviously they need financial freedom and they need financial privacy. And Bitcoin can provide the financial freedom and with some extra hoops to jump through, financial privacy. But you also need communications privacy. You need location privacy. You need operating systems that preserve your privacy. There's a broad spectrum of things that really go into personal privacy, and through personal privacy, enabling human freedom. So at Foundation, we're starting with Bitcoin-centric tech. Essentially, that's just helping people to be able to actually take custody of Bitcoin and use it in a way that's simple, approachable, privacy preserving. Make it so it's not just the tech savvy people who have access to financial freedom through it, but something that's really achievable. But our long-term vision is really for a broad set of technology that helps to simplify self-hosting, that helps to simplify running your own Bitcoin node. Who knows, maybe a router that's privacy preserving, that's VPN-centric and Tor-centric in the future. Really just approaching technology from the perspective of how do we build things that embrace the free and open source software ethos, and also embrace user privacy as a core goal, not just an if we can fit it in, or a marketing gimmick or something like that, but really thinking deeply about how everything we build impacts user privacy, and building to ensure that even the least technical user has access to the most privacy possible for them. Obviously, the more technical the user, the more able they're going to be to do more advanced things. But for most people, we want to make things very accessible and approachable when it comes to privacy. So that's my main focus right now. We can also get into freedom.tech, which is a publication that we've kind of soft launched and are fully launching soon, with a couple of podcasts to go along with it, where we're really trying to shift the needle on the education side of things when it comes to the freedom tech space. But I don't want to ramble too long there.
No, it makes a lot of sense. It's super interesting in my work as a consultant in this space, because I have clients who come to me on a regular basis who want to have Bitcoin. And then they end up with a lot of these ideas on like Bitcoin-like products. It's like, I want to have Bitcoin, but I want it in my IRA. I want to have Bitcoin, but I want to be able to take loans against it and do all this stuff. I want to have Bitcoin, but it needs to be easily tradable, and I need to be able to swap it for other coins, and I need to have an exchange and a access to expensive and all these things. And it's like, I want to have this and I want to have that. And it's just like, guys, you're missing the point. The point of Bitcoin is self-custody. You got to have self-custody. Otherwise, it's not Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin light. It's like it's like food, but it's not real food. It's a substitute. If you're going to go Bitcoin, it's got to be self-custody.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the only place I differ a little bit is I think that some of the Bitcoin community has gone too hardcore on this concept of only doing money with Bitcoin and not thinking about any of those things being built on top. I'm certainly Bitcoin focused. That's my main focus within this space, because I think it provides the best base for building freedom money on top of. But there are so many people that want to be able to do more with their money. I mean, even that simple concept of being able to take out a loan against your Bitcoin, it would be pretty awesome if you could do that directly on Bitcoin in a decentralized way, not having to trust a centralized provider, not having to provide KYC information or something like that. And unfortunately, it's not possible on Bitcoin today. You can, in theory, use your Bitcoin on Ethereum, and there's a lot of trade-offs with custody there. And then you can do a lot of those things there. But it's one of the shortcomings where I would love to see finally the vision of Bitcoin as money in all of its core senses that people understand, which when people think about money, maybe they're thinking about cash, but for most people, money is a checking account, a saving account, loans, the ability to access credit. Like there's a broad spectrum of financial tools that people expect to have. And if Bitcoin can only be savings and spending, we do limit who can get into it. Now, like you said, it all comes back to Bitcoin is self-custody. You have to have that core premise down before you can do anything else.
Well, I'll give you an example because, okay, I think it's cool that you can, if you could take loans against it, but using BlockFi didn't work out very well, right? Like I had clients who were doing these things and posted up, tons of Bitcoin, took loans against it, and then the company went bankrupt. And it's like, oh, wait a second, you no longer have custody of your own Bitcoin. So if there was a decentralized version of this, okay, amazing. I'm happy to work on projects like that, talk about, educate people, but at the core, you still got to self-custody it. Otherwise, it just doesn't it just takes the teeth out of it, like it's just, it's not the same whatsoever. So I think that self custody has to be at the center for these types of things. I want to see Bitcoin expand. I think it's super interesting, Lightning and Liquid and all of these other protocols that we're seeing. But giving up your keys to somebody else, to some institution, and passing on responsibility to them is the opposite of what I stand for.
I definitely agree. I think where people kind of diverge is your concept of Bitcoin a tool to improve your stack of dollars or pounds or yen, whatever your fiat currency is, or is your Bitcoin a tool for you to actually have freedom money? Because I think that's where, if your goal is just increasing the amount of fiat that you have, increasing the dollars in your bank account over the long term, something like an ETF makes sense in that perspective. I don't think that it's best, but it makes sense in that perspective because you're just viewing it as, I'm fine with taxes, I'm fine with a broken financial system, I just want to maximize my returns when I'm retiring, etc. But like you said, it loses its teeth. If you're trying to use this Bitcoin for something that perhaps now is totally legal, but who knows in 30 years when you go to retire, if the thing that you want to be able to do is illegal, or the political party that you side with is illegal, or something that you need to fund, something you need to pay for is not approved by the financial system or by the government that you live under. If your money's in something like an ETF, good luck. It's stuck. Or if the government just says, hey, we're going to 6102 Bitcoin, we're just going to say it's the same as gold, we're going to confiscate all that, we need it, we'll give you some money for it. You can't do anything. It was an ETF. Your money's gone. Sure, you have dollars. You've lost the underlying Bitcoin. There's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent confiscation. There's nothing you can do to choose how and when you're able to use this to actually buy goods and services. But if you do actually take self-custody, if you learn what I think is a pretty simple process of saving a single secret, backing it up safely, and taking custody, you can actually unlock all of what Bitcoin is supposed to be, which is freedom money. And you only get freedom money if you take that personal responsibility, which is daunting because for most people, when they're approaching the financial system, usually you're signing your life away, but you're putting the responsibility on someone else, which unfortunately for a lot of us is the easy thing, the normal thing. And it takes a big perspective shift to understand that me taking personal responsibility for my financial future and for my financial freedom is worth the slight risk, but the time investment in figuring out how to actually do this the right way.
Well, this is why public education, well, there's many reasons public education is horrendous, but this is one of it because they don't want you to take responsibility for these types of things. They're not going to teach you the skills that you need, and they're not going to support you through this journey. That's not by accident. They want an ignorant class on how money functions. This is by design. So it is a personal responsibility in doing the thing. It's also a personal responsibility of educating yourself. And in today's day and age, when there's so much resources out there, really people have no excuse for not doing these types of things. Yes, it takes a few minutes or a few hours to kind of get your head around it. But once you do, it just opens up so many possibilities to you.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why my focus in the space has been education, because there's this gap. It's really, really hard to actually wake someone up to the need for taking personal responsibility and embracing a tool like Bitcoin for their individual freedom. But once those people wake up, we have to have the educational resources available so that they can quickly understand what the tool is, how to use it effectively, simplify that process as much as possible, streamline the actual user experience, and make sure that no one gets lost in this shift from I want to take personal responsibility to I am actually taking personal responsibility. Because a lot of people get lost there when let's say they wake up to the need for personal privacy, but what they stumble upon is these super advanced hacker-esque guides to anonymization on the internet, and you only use Tor, and you have to switch every operating system you use immediately, and you need to delete every account you have online. And they see that it's just this like monumental shift towards a wholly different life, and they get lost and they go, I can't. I just give up. I'll give up what privacy I have because I just can't handle the the loss of simplicity that I'm used to. But if we can help users to understand that you can actually take it a step at a time, you can start small, you can work your way towards individual freedom through taking personal responsibility in different areas, and just showing them all of the fantastic technology that's out there to simplify this process. Because I think that's where a lot of other people get lost, is they don't actually know where to go. Like, I want private communication, but can I do that with WhatsApp? Is their encryption good enough? Can I do that with Facebook Messenger and their supposed intent encryption? Like, do I need to switch to Signal? What's Threema, SimpleX? Like, people get lost in all this. So a lot of it falls down to people like you and me who are doing education to help to really simplify that process. And that's where my passion really lies, is trying to find the best ways to do that while also building products that fit within that and that embrace all of the ideas of freedom tech.
So let's talk then about some of the levers. Like, what are the largest levers that people can do for the least amount of effort, but to get the most out of it? That Pareto's Law 80-20. What are the big things that people could listen to today's episode and then this afternoon go out there and make some real life changes in their life?
Yeah, this is one where I think the most impactful content that I've ever made is just a really simple guide that walks people through the 10 things that I would do if I was starting my privacy journey from scratch, and trying to keep it very simple, very step by step. And a lot of people don't realize the amount of impact that you can have by just shifting a few things. So we've already talked about Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin, or maybe Monero, which is like I mentioned earlier, privacy preserving, similar thing to Bitcoin. We don't need to get into the details, but taking advantage of the tools that are there for financial freedom is a great place to start, because ultimately a lot of the other tools are better enabled if you have a way to actually pay for them in a way that doesn't link your identity directly to that thing. So it doesn't have to be the starting point. Like I mentioned in the blog post, like, it's very much up to what you think is most valuable to you. So I think starting with the idea of like, what's most valuable to me? What lengths am I willing to go to protect it, and who am I protecting it from? It's a concept called threat modeling. That's pretty well known these days. And starting from there. So I think approaching something like Bitcoin, trying to find a way to gain some financial freedom, just starting small, buying some, whether it's on a centralized exchange or it's buying some from a friend, family member, local ATM, and making sure that you actually take custody of that. Is one of the most important starting points. I think in addition to that, the two most important things that someone can do is start using a privacy preserving browser. So much of what we do online is surveilled quite easily by corporations. And the simplest way to block the vast majority of that is just start using something like Brave browser. You don't have to do much. You don't have to go through some fancy configuration guide. There's some stuff about Brave browser I don't love, but overall, they do a really good job of setting good, sane defaults that immediately shift the power towards privacy back into your hands, away from all of the websites and entities that you're interacting with online.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Brave, because,
yeah.
and I'm going to interject here for 1 second, because I have had privacy advocates on this program before, and I have a lot of privacy advocates who I consult with and are personal friends of mine, and they don't love Brave because it's not perfect. But I'm like, but it's pretty cool. Like, it works out of the box, and you don't need to be technical at all. It's so familiar, and so just, you can get into the groove with it in like 4 minutes. And so if it's, hey, I'm going to stay on, Microsoft or Google, Chrome or something like that, because the idea of transferring to something that's going to be perfect or 99% of the way is so difficult or so hard to understand that they never get around to it, opposed to Brave, where it's like you just download it, you swap over, and it works immediately. It's like, I think that's pretty rad. Like, let's go and use Brave, because of all of those reasons.
Yeah, I think it's something that's very lost in the privacy space, and something that I'm going to a conference in March, and I think the topic I'm going to actually talk about is kind of railing against privacy maximalism, because there's this concept within the privacy space where anybody who falls deeply down the privacy rabbit hole, they knowingly or unknowingly try to take their threat model, their concept of what are the must-haves for personal privacy, and they try to apply that to everyone else. So people who are very technical, advanced, they understand lots of things that the average person has no idea what's going on. They do things like they take Mozilla Firefox, they do Arkin.js, which is a custom config that changes all of these things within Firefox to make it better. Or maybe they're using Mullvad browser and not changing anything so that they have the exact same fingerprint as others. Or maybe they're using Tor browser for literally everything that they do online. And those things are totally fine. And for many people, they should get there someday, especially to something like a Mullvad browser. But like you mentioned, the important thing when we're talking to the kind of general populace, the people who are wondering, what's that step that I take, is getting them a tool that disrupts their workflow as little as possible, but gives them a strong privacy improvement while doing it. And that's why things like Brave are just fantastic. If you've used Google Chrome, you could just install Brave, import everything, set up a Brave account for sync between devices, and you just live your life. You don't think about it. You don't go, I'm thinking consciously about the privacy decisions I make on every website. You don't have to go through a laundry list of extensions, but you save a lot of your data from getting in the hands of other corporations, governments, et cetera, for very little lift. And it's things like that that actually make the most difference. Mm-hmm. There is extreme value in things like Mullvad browser, Tor browser, et cetera. Like obviously those are must-haves and things that people should educate themselves on as they go down their rabbit hole. But you have to start simpler, and you have to start with something that actually has a good user experience at its base so that the friction is not high. The same thing goes for when we're talking about messengers. There's lots of fantastic messengers out there, but the reason why Signal has far and away been the most popular is because you just use it. Mm-hmm. You don't think about encryption. You don't verify anyone's encryption keys for the most part. You just put in your phone number, register, you start messaging friends. And that concept of switching simply from something else to that and onboarding people who don't actually care about privacy, but when they get onboarded, they actually gain privacy. And when they get onboarded, you get better privacy as well, is a really vital part of how we actually get Freedom Tech in the hands of more people.
How about Telegram? What's your opinion on Telegram?
Overall, I dislike it for sure. I do not like the overall architecture. The encryption tools are okay, but non-default, which is a big deal, and have a lot of restrictions when you do actually enable them. I think it's fine. I think I kind of classify messengers for two different purposes. When I'm doing one-on-one messaging, which is where, in my opinion, you need strong privacy by default, I'm not going to use Telegram or anything like that unless I absolutely have to. I use it a lot in my business because I work for a company that's in the cryptocurrency space, and Telegram is huge there. So I do use it for that. But if at all humanly possible, messaging someone directly, I'm not using Telegram. I'm using something that I know, even if Signal is evil, they can't get access to all of the things that I'm saying. So I'm going to focus on using something like Signal, or SimpleX is another good alternative for that purpose. But the other side of things, and this is again where I think kind of the privacy maximalist lose side of things, if you have a public group that anyone can join, privacy doesn't matter. Intent encryption doesn't matter. I don't know why that concept doesn't click for so many people, but they think like we have this group chat, we have to have it on something like Signal. No, anyone can join. You're already sharing the link out. A 3-letter agency, a hacker, a corporation, whatever, anyone can join as a pseudonym, as whatever, and be surveilling everything. Not to mention that anyone who's already in the group could just be sending the messages to someone else. There's no way to prevent that by any kind of technological means. So that's kind of where I separate things out. I think Telegram is actually pretty solid when it comes to a group messenger, or for having like a group chat for your company or your product, support, et cetera. But I personally wouldn't advise using it for one-on-one messaging. I would advise using something that has strong intent encryption by default, no extra steps, no extra hoops to jump through, like Signal.
Amazing. I use Signal and I use it for lots of things, but I love Telegram with the user interface. Like I have all my employees on Telegram, and instead of using Slack or something like that, we use Telegram for group chats. Now, the majority of the things that we're talking about are, hey, who's going to be the podcast guest of next week? Well, next week that becomes public information, so it's not exactly a privacy center. This is the blog article that we're working on. Hey, did you get this support email, or did this person been responded to? We have a 20-person team, and Telegram, just the user interface and the ability to interact and to send data and pictures and videos and everything is just it's so smooth and so nice to work with that if I ever have to go back, I live in Latin America. So Latin America is WhatsApp, like all WhatsApp for everything. And I go on this and I'm like, this is so clunky and archaic and horrible. Sure, WhatsApp 10 years ago was a nice improvement over SMS, but there's just so many other options out there now. And I get on Telegram and I'm like, this is really easy to use.
Yeah, I think it's sad but true, because I would love that we could do things like work chats in a tool that was encrypted, that we didn't have to self-host to gain privacy, because there are lots of tools that you could host yourselves if you wanted to host like a Mattermost server or something. But even then, the UX is just, it's not going to be there compared to something like Telegram. So it's a similar situation with Discord, where a lot of projects, even ones that are focused on privacy, use Discord for their public chats, just because the user interface is way better. The things that you can do on there are so much improved over if you're just doing like a simple Signal group chat, that it's kind of an unfortunate but necessary means to an end to use something like that. Again, I think for group chats, totally fine. I don't really have a problem with that. The bigger problems come with like Discord, where they're much more invasive in the data that they collect in their apps. Telegram's better than most in that situation. Just like you can run a Telegram free and open source version on Android. So there's some flexibility there, which I enjoy. I think Telegram's better than most, especially when it comes to that trade-off between user experience and some privacy features, some open source code, et cetera. But yeah, it's kind of the sad state of things. I mean, it's the same like at Foundation. We are deeply have this culture of personal privacy at the core of who we are. We have people who work in the company who are just NIMs that we don't actually know their names. Obviously the company does, but other coworkers, we don't know their real names, where they live, et cetera. We have a deep culture of that, but we use an app that's not encrypted by default for our work messaging, because there comes a point where you can't sacrifice so much productivity to do this when there's not that much benefit to it. Like you mentioned, talking about something like that, if it was to be intercepted by a 3-letter agency, or God forbid the servers of the company were hacked and the messages were leaked, it's not the end of the world to do that. It's not like you're having a deeply personal chat on that platform. And
they're
going
to find out that
tools.
Seth for Privacy is going to be on the podcast this week. Well, surprise everyone, he's here. So exactly. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I do think, once again, that Pareto's law, if you swap from something like Facebook Messenger to Signal, or even maybe to a lesser extent Telegram, I still think you're getting a massive improvement over your privacy than WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And you have to focus, especially when you're thinking about something that's social, you have to think carefully about what tool you're going to try and switch to, because you have to get your friends and family, colleagues, et cetera, to switch to that thing, or it's totally useless. There's been so many new messengers that have really interesting concepts, that have good privacy, that have reasonable UX or some different quirk about them. But if you can't get people to actually use it, a messenger app with no people to message is just pointless. And so I think a lot of it comes back to, you have to actually be able to get your friends and family on that. I have all my friends and family on Signal. I don't message any of them on text messages, which unfortunately is still the norm in America. Much less like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger. I was able to get everyone off of that onto Signal. We all use that for everything. And that's only possible because Signal's UX is pretty good. It's not fantastic for group chats, but it's good enough for like family, friends, et cetera.
Amazing. So we talked Bitcoin, we talked browsers, we've talked messengers. What would be next of an easy step that people could put into place today that would actually move the lever?
Yeah, I think my next one would probably be, and this is pretty divisive as well within the privacy space, is the concept of using an always-on VPN all the time. Just embracing the slight pain that you'll experience by some websites serving you captchas over and over again, or some apps blocking you, but starting to take back your broad online privacy in ways that you can't through just switching browsers or through just switching your operating system. Because there's lots of different people who unfortunately want to prey on your data. One of the most harmful and the most powerful entities that can do that is your actual internet service provider, whether that's on mobile, someone like AT&T in the US, or whether that's for your house, someone like Spectrum or something like that. They have immense power in not only what data they see about what you do, but actually being able to insert things like ads into the tools that you're using, to actually intercept apps that you're trying to download, replace them with malicious files. They have a massive amount of power over your use of the internet and your data. So cutting them out and shifting trust. It's important with VPNs. You're not removing trust. What you're doing is you're shifting trust. You're saying, I trust this VPN provider. Let's use Mullvad as an example. I trust Mullvad, who do not have my identity. I paid in Bitcoin. I just have an account number. They don't know an email address. They don't know a phone number. They don't have an ID. They don't have any of that information about me. I trust them as a company who makes money by providing privacy tools and has a reputation that will be destroyed if they break that trust. I trust them with my data far more than I trust Spectrum or someone who has a long track record of abusing user data to increase their profits. So that I think is one of the more powerful ones. It has a very bad rap because I think in the earlier days of VPNs, not only were there just tons of malicious ones that people used unknowingly that were just actually collecting data themselves, but the actual experience of using an always-on VPN has gotten much better with the broad spread of WireGuard, which is a different protocol for VPN that makes it almost as fast as your internet connection if you have a good VPN provider. So that's one where I think it's the juice is worth the squeeze because it's essentially just create an account, pay for it, install the app, sign in, and just live your life. It's just like the browser. You don't actually have to do very much to gain a lot of privacy improvements. There are some caveats to that. And like I said, you are shifting trust. You're not removing trust. Things like Tor are still very useful when you need to be anonymous and not just gain privacy. But I think that's another kind of starting point that people can take that doesn't require a lot of technical know-how.
What about the big VPN providers like ExpressVPN or NordVPN? What's your opinion on these? Because I kind of look at these and they kind of seem like big monster companies. And I just gotta wonder, like, how were they allowed to get so big? Like, I would just think the CIA and all these companies, the big three-letter agencies, would have backdoors for everything. And it's like, I don't know, but am I just being paranoid, or what's your opinion on this?
So you should approach any VPN provider with extreme skepticism. You should do a lot of research to make sure that the one that you're choosing is legitimate, has a long track record of protecting users. Hopefully, they also have examples in court cases of how governments were not able to get them to actually give over any personally identifying information because they didn't have it or they didn't collect it. But unfortunately, because it's something that promises privacy, it's an interesting honeypot. So there's a lot of really bad VPN companies who have been rampant in the space. A lot of the popular VPNs are actually owned by the same larger company. I don't have all the details to go into today, but there's a lot of good research out there as to how a lot of the big VPNs that you hear in every single YouTube video that you watch as an ad, they're actually malicious. They're actually collecting data for themselves, and they're just finding ways to prey on users who think they're getting privacy but aren't actually. So there's some really good resources out there to look into these more. TechLore is a YouTuber who's focused on privacy, who has a site where he ranks VPNs. He has a lot of info on each of them. I think he's very trustworthy, someone I know personally. And then, like, for me, I really only would recommend one of three VPNs. There's hundreds out there. Very few are actually good and proven over the years. That's Mullvad, which is a very well-known, probably the largest known good VPN provider out there. They're absolutely fantastic. For me, keys with VPN providers are you have to be able to pay with a form of payment that's not a credit card, that's not actually tied to you. Because again, you're shifting trust. You're trusting this entity with your internet traffic, and they can do a lot of surveillance. They could log. There's no way to prove that you do not log as a company. If a company says that they guarantee not to log or they provide some promise of that, it's only a promise. There's no way that they can prove it to you that they don't do that, and they could shift it at any point. So a big key is you have to be able to pay in a payment method that doesn't give over your identity. So that's basically Bitcoin or Monero. So accepting Bitcoin or Monero is vital. And all three of the ones that I suggest do accept at least Bitcoin. So Mullvad, huge one, really good track record, great example of how to run a company in a way that cares about user privacy. And every single person that I know within the privacy space appreciates Mullvad. Even if they don't use them, they view them as a trustworthy, useful tool. Another one is iVPN, a very similar model to Molbod, smaller. I know a lot of the guys who actually work there, really good team, and I've used them personally for years. Again, they accept Bitcoin and Monero so that you can pay without giving over your identity. And something that Molbot and iVPN share that I really appreciate is you don't have to log in with an email address. You don't have to have an email account with them, nothing like that. When you create an account, it actually just creates a random user name, which is really just a set of letters and numbers for you. You just save that, no password. You don't need to worry about any of that. You just pay, and that account number now has access to VPN. So you also don't have to have like a hide my email or something to not link your regular personal email to your VPN service. And then the third that I would recommend is Proton VPN. Proton as a company has shown themselves to be fantastic over the years. They get some vitriol in the privacy space because courts have taken them to court multiple times to get user info. And because they're a large company, they have to give over anything that they have, which usually is like what IP address people are accessing Proton Mail or Proton VPN from. Everybody can give that up. And if the company you're trusting is a company, they're going to have to give that up to law enforcement. It's just how this works. If you can't use that, or if you can't deal with that trust assumption, you need to use something like Tor. But they have a really good track record. Proton VPN works well. They have a generous free tier. They also accept Bitcoin for using Proton VPN. Their Bitcoin acceptance is pretty wonky and the process isn't great. I hope they improve it over the years, but those are really the only three that I would trust and recommend. And the vast majority out there, especially if you see them in tons of ads on YouTube, you should assume it's not trustworthy.
Amazing. Well, that's a good segue because the one I was going to ask you about next is email providers. And for a privacy-centric email provider, by far the most popular is Proton Mail. So I'm curious, actually, your thoughts on Proton Mail. Is it a good out-of-the-box option for people, or do they need to go farther down the rabbit hole to find something which is going to move the needle?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Proton Mail user, huge fan. Their whole suite is really, really well built out. It is what I would recommend. It's, to me, in the same vein as Brave and Signal, in that you can start using it without too much headache. Great apps, great support across ecosystems. It's really, again, really well built, really good track record, proven in court that they cannot provide any email contents to a court. Like I said, they can provide what IP address you access Proton email with. That's just the nature of the internet. But a really good track record, good usability. And again, there have been a lot of other offerings. Tutanota is probably the only other one that's recognizable enough with a good enough user experience that it's reasonable, but a lot of other ones have come and gone. Email is something where the protocol itself is not inherently private. So you have to approach it differently than something like Signal, where everything is going to be end-to-end encrypted. If you're using something like Proton Mail, the thing that you're trying to avoid is an email provider who is using knowledge of all of your emails to prey on you or to sell your data. That is not, you can't get away from basically the internet at large, anyone who's serving emails, being able to spy on the contents of your email. Most email is still plain text. It's terrible, still the state of things most of the time. But if you are using Proton Mail, one of the advantages is that if you're emailing another user of Proton, that is end-to-end encrypted by default, and you don't have to do any extra steps. You don't have to deal with GPG keys, anything like that. It just works. And because Proton's by far the largest privacy-preserving email provider, you're going to have that happen far more than if you're using any other email provider out there. So I definitely do recommend them. I think they work very well. And again, you can go deeper. There are some more anonymous hosting providers that you can use for email, but you start to lose usability. And like you mentioned, that kind of 80-20 rule. You can get pretty much everything you need from Proton Mail that you could get from some other service without having to deal with a lot of the headache that goes with that. And for me, the most important thing is that people take that first step and then they figure out if there's a further step that they need to take. But switching from something like Gmail to Proton Mail, it's painful just because switching email addresses is painful still, unfortunately. But it's relatively achievable because the actual user experience of using Proton is solid overall.
Yeah. And it's pretty cool because I have a lot of clients of mine who are their 60s, 70s, early 80s who are private clients of mine. And loads of them are on Proton Mail. And it's just so nice to get, when they start working with me and they're on Hotmail, and then a couple months later, I see them, hey, this is my new Proton Mail account. Can you start emailing me here? I'm like, yes, I can. That's awesome. And it's not a huge barrier to entry with an understanding of technology or anything like that. Like it's easy to use. Actually, I find Proton Mail pretty sexy when you get in there and the setup of it. I think it's really nice to use. And I can't say that with lots of the mass adopted non-privacy centric email. Like try to go use Hotmail or something like that now. And it's like, or Outlook, and you're like, what? I'm going back to the 90s. This is horrendous. It's so unbelievable. So I like Proton Mail, but it's interesting to get your opinion if it is privacy centric enough to take care of the general public.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think you hit on a really good point there, which is that companies like Proton, they have to sell you on the feature set. They can't just sell you on privacy. That is part of it. And some people will switch just for privacy. But if the process of using it is too painful, no one's going to pay money for that. And Proton, because they are privacy preserving by default, they can't do a free plan that preys on your data and just sells your data to subsidize their services. So they have to take a different approach, and it has to be a tool that's actually good enough that people want to use it, even if they don't care about personal privacy that much. Maybe they care a little bit, or maybe just their kids said, hey, use this email address instead and set up an account for them. But they have to take a different perspective, which is one of the most powerful things in the free and open source space as well, but also in the privacy space, is because you have to break this paradigm of selling user data. You kind of break this concept of a monopoly that just gets so big that they have so much user data that they don't have to care if the product works or not. They're just able to subsidize any cost that they don't get from users actually paying. They can just sell the data, make infinite money off of that, it seems, and not worry about the actual product that they're serving to users. So that's another good shift when you start to get into the space, is when you're actually paying for a product, you'll realize that they actually care about you as a user. Whereas when you're the product and your data is how they're paying for your usage of their platform, usually they couldn't give a damn if you were a Hotmail user or you want to switch or you don't like some feature. They're not going to care. Whereas Proton's really going to listen to their user base a lot more.
Amazing. Well, I'll let you go in a second if you have other big levers, but one that I wanted to bring up while I'm thinking about it is file sharing. Do you recommend, in the same vein, Proton Drive? Do you use like Mega NZ or one of these ones with zero knowledge? What do you think is a good first step for people with file sharing software online?
I think this is where there's not a perfect solution yet. I think Proton Drive is probably the closest, but it's not quite there yet. There's a lot of kind of a seamless nature that people have gotten used to with things like Box or Google Drive or a lot of other hosting providers at this point that aren't privacy preserving, and they're not willing to sacrifice all of those features yet for storing files. I think Proton Drive is probably the most capable one at this point, but it's still really early. Honestly, I want to use it all the time, but there's still not Linux sync available. The web UI is a little clunky. It still feels a bit beta, which it is their newest product. So that's understandable. It takes time to build out something like that. But I think file sharing is really one area where I think there's a lot of work to be done. I host my own Nextcloud instance, and I use that for all of my kind of personal file sharing. But I know a lot of people who are privacy conscious still use things like Google Drive because, again, there's kind of this cutoff where the loss of productivity isn't, and this sounds horrible to say as someone who loves privacy, but the loss of productivity isn't worth sacrificing or isn't worth giving up privacy for. So they're willing to give up a little bit more privacy to have something that's easier to use. But I have started using Drive more recently. I've started using it with sharing with external users who aren't on Drive, and that process has gotten a lot better. So I think it's getting there, but definitely still has a ways to go. And I think that's probably one of the spaces within the privacy space where it has to improve to win people over on features and not just privacy. Because again, that's the hard part. There are a lot of us that care deeply about personal privacy and are willing to sacrifice some usability. But there is just this line where if you have to cross it, it's a very niche market, and it's going to be hard to find people who can use it. The nice thing with something like file sharing is if it's accessible to someone who doesn't have an account on that platform, it doesn't really matter if it's clunky as long as they can go to link, click download, done. So it's more like on me to deal with the clunkiness of Proton Drive, as long as the link that I send to someone works. So it's better. It's a better situation than like social messaging platforms. But I think definitely has a long ways to go. I'm curious, what's kind of your preference when it comes to file sharing?
Well, so we use Mega and Zed for important documents, and I got it recommended to me by Ramiro from Above Phone. And he's a very good friend of mine, and I trust his opinion. He made a recommendation that Mega was legit. So important files we use on there. However, also I'm looking at word processing, right? So I'm going to write a blog article. It's going to take me 2-3 hours to write it. Then I have my proofreader, beta readers. I got someone on who's a typesetter who comes in, does the formatting, things like this. And then a week later, it's going to arrive on our website, right? Do I care about the privacy as I'm working on the article and having it on Google Drive and Google Docs? No, I don't. It doesn't matter, because the ability to share that information freely with a team member and have them interact with it in real time is so convenient. And I'm trying to run a successful business and get the information out, that I think that is a fantastic option. So I do use Google Docs. I mean, I'm guilty here. It's such an amazing user interface that for things like writing a blog article or writing my show notes for today's interview with you, which will go public, that makes a ton of sense. I've never found anything that is so convenient for word processing and file sharing all in one spot without making it clunky. And and what's the options? What are the other options? Like Microsoft Office or something like that? Like, that's not private. Like, that's probably worse than a Google Suite product. So I don't know. That's how I think about it. That's my perspective.
And I think it's a good way to approach it. I mean, we talked about earlier with messengers, where you kind of have to do things with this dichotomy of like, what is public or is going to be public and what needs to stay private. Not everything needs the same privacy if it's something that is going to be a public thing anyways, that's going to be in the public domain. You can have some different perspective on how you actually approach these things. It's just like people using GitHub, which we know they mine data, they want to consume the data on everything that's happening there. And yet every developer, even a privacy preserving tools, almost is using GitHub because it's an open source project, theoretically. It's an open source project anyways that you're going to be sharing. You shouldn't really need to care about the privacy aspects of it. And on I guess not the flip side of that, but an important thing to remember with that is that using something like Brave, using a good always on VPN, means that when you're using these tools that are made by companies that do have a track record of mining user data, you can prevent that aspect of things. Obviously, they're still going to have the content that you're putting into a Google Doc, but you can prevent all of the built-in tracking in Google Docs. You can prevent them from learning your true IP address with a VPN. All of these things that we've talked about make it so that using tools like that out of necessity, honestly, is less harmful to your specific privacy as well, which I think is important. The only other thing I would add is we actually recently switched from Google Docs to Notion with my company, and I really, really recommend it. They at least talk about privacy more openly and seem to care. They also just bought Skiff, which was a kind of privacy-centric suite, similar to Proton, offering a lot of the same things. So there seems to be some commitment to privacy there, but just generally, I think the tool set is way better than Google Docs, and they don't have the same horrible track record as Google as far as kind of data invasion goes.
I always think of Notion more as a note-taking app. Like, I kind of think of it like Evernote and things like that. I never really put that into a full, like, we write books and long form content. I never really thought of Notion as like a full fleshed out word processing type of platform, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely did start as that, but it's grown quickly. I mean, you can use it for project management now, a broad swath of like word processing. I use it for all my blogs, Twitter threads, every piece of content that I create, podcast show notes. We use it for a lot of like internal company docs. It's a really powerful tool, and in our experience, is far more powerful than things like Google Docs. Amazing. Because it's a lot more flexible. I mean, it's different, but it has all the core things that at least we needed out of Google Docs, with a lot of added functionality that honestly is a lot better. So we really enjoyed it. I think it's good. I think it's, so far that I've tested, it's the best non-self-hosted kind of processing tool. Again, not privacy preserving by default, but like we talked about, I don't think that matters as much when the majority of things on there are things that are going to be public anyways.
Amazing. Well, I'll take another look at them because the last time I looked was quite a while ago. Mm-hmm. Here is a question for you. And it kind of goes back to our conversation about threat modeling. Now, part of my fear of using new startup companies is that, yes, they might have great intentions, but if they don't have huge funding behind them, it's not just like what they promise they're going to be able to do, but what they actually can do. Now, Google is an absolute behemoth. And if you're worried about hackers getting access to your data, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to hack Google servers and come after your data. Okay, Google themselves are going to be reading things or cataloging things. I get that. But when we're talking at the threat modeling, what are we protecting threats from? If it's from hackers, Google might actually be a good option for this. What's your perspective?
I definitely agree. Yeah, I mean, it depends on if your focus is preserving that data from being accessible to anyone, or if you have a specific entity like unauthorized access, rather than being okay with Google having access to that. I mean, like we've been talking about what we use in our businesses. I think you usually have a different perspective. Usually you don't care too much if the company who you're hosting this stuff with has access to it. Obviously, in an ideal world, it would be end-to-end encrypted. They wouldn't have access and it would work just as well as anything else. Unfortunately, that's not really reality. So usually the focus is we don't want, let's say, a competitor having access to internal documents. And like you mentioned, I mean, Google, I would say, is at the bleeding edge of security and is probably the most secure place for anything of anyone out there. They have a long track record of this, a massive cybersecurity team with extreme expertise. Like, they know what they're doing. They are not good for privacy, but I would say they're probably the best or one of the best choices when it comes to data security. And that is where this idea of threat modeling comes into play, because I mean, I still feel like you should almost always try to avoid using someone like Google, because they're going to try to use this data to essentially farm out and make money off of you. And that will cause privacy issues that are not limited to just Google. That's the other side of things, is that it's not that only Google will have access to that, but also all their partners, all the data brokers they sell the data to. There's a much broader net that these things get into. You're not just trusting Google. So that's where a lot of the kind of the pain comes in, and where like it can be fine to have company docs on there, but you probably don't want to have like medical records in Google Drive, because that could be used to prey on you. That could change how insurance looks at you in the future, because maybe something private gets into the hands of a data broker that an insurance company looks at to try to decide how they're going to serve you. There's a lot of potential fallout, and that's not even touching on the implications of a government being able to subpoena Google or just ask nicely in a lot of cases for a user's data, and Google will just give that up because they're a massive company. They care more about profit than they care about you, the user. Most people are using free plans. They're not going to protect your $0 of input for their relationships with law enforcement. So it's hard to threat model because companies are not upfront about where their data goes. But you do have to take into effect, do I care most about unauthorized access, or is this something where I need privacy so that I can have freedom now or in the future from my local government, from corporations themselves, from data brokers? And that's where having the choice to use things that are actually privacy preserving in nature for those sensitive things, and then using things like Google Docs for things where you don't need privacy, is important. And that's where understanding the tools and understanding the trade-offs is really, really valuable and hard. And that's where it comes down to educators to kind of draw those lines and make it clear where those differences are. And where, like we talked about before, I think we can't take the stance of privacy maximalism, because if I said you can never use Google, you can never use Notion, you can never use any of these things that are end-to-end encrypted, it's likely that the amount of work you or your company can actually do will be drastically harmed. And if your company is trying to do something that is actually getting freedom tech in the hands of people, you probably you probably can't suffer that much productivity loss to do those things. So it's really not one size fits all. You have to figure out what's your aim. What are you trying to gain freedom from or protect yourself from now or in the future? And the in the future part, I think, is one that a lot of people forget, because even though the things you're doing now may be totally legal, totally above board, no issues, laws can change very quickly. You cannot trust that the current government and the current set of laws will persist. And so you have to really plan out your future, which is where privacy tools make it a lot easier, because you don't have to worry about, is Signal going to access these messages that right now are fine, but maybe in 50 years, this is something that counts as treason against my government or something like that. And making that threat modeling with someone like Google is a lot harder, because who knows how long that data is going to persist, who they're going to give it to, et cetera.
Makes sense. I mean, my last point on this is I think you're 100% right with the productivity piece, because one of the big tenets in my work is that I want my clients to be as wealthy as humanly possible. Because I think when we look at what's happening in the world, that if you are extremely wealthy, you are going to be able to handle things so much better than if you are poor. So I want to see people to be productive. I want to see them have successful businesses and add value and charge large amounts of money for these services. And so there always has to be some type of I don't want to call it a give and take, because it shouldn't have to be this way, but it is this way. There are things like in our conversation about Google. Yes, I understand Google is an evil corporation, but you know what? Their Google Docs works really, really well. So if you're writing something and it's easy to share and it's going to be public anyways, does it really matter? Do you need to go down the privacy rabbit hole on every aspect in your life? And I would suggest not really. I think that you need to look at the situation, understand what the goals and the objectives are, and then see where the give and take is, and then make smart decisions based on that. But you do have to take a step backwards and kind of mentally, plan this out or map this out to understand where you should put the time, energy, effort, and in this case, money.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's that point that you mentioned of you do have to step back and actually think these things through is the vital one, because you don't necessarily have to change everything about your privacy setup. But if you never stop to think about, how am I approaching messaging? How am I approaching a productivity suite? How am I approaching email? How am I approaching anonymity online? If you don't actually take stock of all these things and think through it, you may miss one key aspect that actually severely limits your freedom either now or in the future. And you didn't actually take the steps you could have back then. That's another one of the hard things that I just harped on a little bit, but you're not just deciding for the here and now, you're deciding for the future as well. So that's where I think, whenever possible, you should be using privacy preserving apps, end-to-end encryption and everything. That should be your default go-to, and then making exceptions out of that when absolutely necessary. And to me, I think that you should have kind of an internal red tape, where if you're going to make an exception, you should have to kind of justify to yourself clearly, why am I doing this? Is it just because I want to save a tiny bit of work, but I'm sacrificing all of my privacy to do that? You probably shouldn't be doing that. But if, again, like we talked about, it's the difference between putting out one article a month that's educating people on the impact of privacy, data invasion, surveillance, et cetera, versus 8 articles a month, you have to make that decision differently. So again, it's not one size fits all, but yeah, it is very important that you do take stock of that. And my recommendation is, whenever possible, you are using something that actually cares about your user privacy, and you are hopefully paying for that or giving back to the company or project that's building those tools. It's a whole nother topic, but funding within the free and open source space and the privacy preserving space is tricky in a very different situation, because they can't just use your data.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. The default should be privacy, and then you should make exceptions to that, not the default being whatever is the most convenient and then making exceptions on certain things to protect your privacy. It's got to be privacy first. My point is only that there can be exceptions and there are realities in life. And as business owners, we need to also look at what is our productivity and what we're going to do to try to maximize our returns and our business and the people that we serve. So privacy first, 100%. I'm not a maxi. I think that there can be slight exceptions to things. Don't hate on me for this. I just think that, I'm a pragmatist. I live in the real world.
You're always going to get hate for nuance and not thinking things in a black and white perspective, but it's worth it. I found kind of the sweet spot is never perfectly satisfying any one community or group within the space. So there's always going to be lashback, but almost always the right place to be is one that's nuanced and not black and white.
Well, I mean, I work with real clients in the real world. I run a 7-figure consulting business helping people to have more freedom in their life, to move offshore, to be expats. If I was such a maxi in everything that I did, none of my clients would accomplish anything. Like, I can go down the rabbit hole as good as anybody, not just on privacy, but on everything. And then it becomes too difficult. I would rather find these small levers or even medium-sized levers that are going to, make a difference in someone's life and have real benefits and freedom today, not just a hypothetical exercise on what it would be like, but like, let's actually do something today. Because everything I work in is on the practical side, not the philosophical, not the theoretical side of things. And actually, once you start stacking up these things, you really do have a ton more freedom in your life. But you got to get going. You got to actually take the steps. And if the steps are too hard, you won't start. And I guess that's the message I'm trying to leave people with here.
Yeah. And I think it's a fantastic message. And it comes back to this kind of original definition of privacy, which is the ability to selectively reveal oneself to the world. Privacy is not having nothing known about you. Privacy is that you get to choose. And that's ultimately what these technologies, these things like Signal, like Proton Mail enable, is that you are getting to choose. For once, we actually have a choice now. You don't just have to use Gmail because it's what everyone else uses and there's no better option. You can choose. And for most people, you should be choosing that and you should be using that. But it is selectively revealed. There's sometimes you need to reveal stuff. I mean, I would prefer that I was totally anonymous and never showed my face on video and no one knew anything about me. But then also my impact to actually educate people on the need for privacy, on the steps that they should take, making things actionable, that reach would be drastically limited, in my opinion. So I've made that conscious decision to reveal more about myself because I think that I can impact broader human freedom more by doing this than I could if I went hardcore into privacy and anonymity. So again, it's you having the choice, which is really the power of privacy. It's not necessarily anonymity or perfect privacy, but it's this concept of you have the choice.
Yep. I have a very good friend of mine, Gabriel Custodiat. He was down here in Panama visiting me a couple of weeks ago. I've been friends with him for, I want to call it 3 or 4 years, 4 years now. And I'd never seen what he looks like ever in my life. After many interviews, speaking at my conferences, emails back and forth, talked so many times, and I'd never seen his face until he came here to visit me. And it was just kind of a funny experience of actually meeting him. And that was a decision that he's made, that he won't appear in video. For my work, yes, I'm privacy centric, but this is my real face and my real name. And I decided in my work that I wanted to be a lighthouse. I wanted to shine light on what was considered a very, I don't know what polite way to say it, but like unsavory aspect of the offshore markets. And I wanted to show that, no, there are completely legal and reasonable reasons for wanting to go down this path. And here they are. And I wanted to build up trust with that. And for that, I selectively chose to use my real face and my real name in all of my work.
Yeah. And that's the power, is we can have people at every different kind of stage of privacy and anonymity. And people like Gabriel, fantastic podcast, fantastic person. He has taken things a step further than we have. And what that does give him is maybe it reduces his reach. Obviously, we could kind of have an argument on that, and I would love to talk more about that with him. But what it does give him is much more resilience. If there's a crackdown on people educating about privacy or people educating about becoming an expat, it's going to be a lot easier to shut down people like me and you because our faces are everywhere. Our names are there. There's info about us out in the public because we've made that choice. And that's a downside. Whereas going after someone like Gabriel, going to be a lot harder because he's thought deeply about his privacy, and he's chosen a more pseudonymous, not anonymous, but pseudonymous path than we have. And there's benefit in kind of being at every stage of that, because there's a resilience improvement and a privacy improvement. And it also models that it is possible to do these things and still do education at the same time. So there's really benefit in being at every aspect of that spectrum. And again, because of these tools, we're actually able to do that, which is it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing time to be alive, even though there's so much bad in the world. There's also so much just absolutely amazing tech being built that simplifies privacy for the average person. I think it's a fantastic place to be, and an exciting time to be alive as we actually get to use these things, teach others, onboard others.
For sure, for sure. Well, we talked about a ton in this episode, and I'm kind of out of, the big levers. But if you got one more in your toolbox, one more tool in the toolbox, I'm happy to go through that on easy things that people could put into place that will actually make a difference and protect their privacy online.
I think just the last one that I'll quickly plug that's been really useful for me has been using an email aliasing service. So this sounds really foreign to people if you haven't looked into this concept before, and it sparks a lot of interesting conversations when you try to give an email address to like a company or over the phone or something. But using something like Simple Login, which Proton actually acquired them a few years ago, so it's nicely integrated within Proton now, essentially allows you to just, whenever you give out an email address, you can create a unique alias for that business, that entity, that newsletter, et cetera, instead of giving out your static single email address. It sounds more complex than it is. It's really just tap one button, create email address, copy paste. It's not complex. It works really well. But what that does for you is it means that when inevitably some of the businesses that you frequent or the accounts you have online, the company behind them is hacked, that email address is leaked, your actual email address is not leaked. When those things start being used for phishing, when those things start being used to figure out what other websites you have accounts on, they can't use that email to log in anywhere else. And they also can't actually really spam you, because all you have to do to prevent spam to that email address is just turn off the alias. So it's a very useful tool, both for security and privacy. Prevents simple linking between your accounts online when you're not giving up identity, and also just protects you against a lot of cases of phishing and malware. So I think it's a really useful tool. It's a little bit more advanced, but like I said, if you're already using something like Proton Mail, you can use Simple Login directly within Proton Mail. I think they just call it Proton Aliases now. But you can directly use them within that. So that's another one that I think is useful, but probably is a little bit further down the rabbit hole for most people.
Cool. Well, amazing conversation today, Seth. I really appreciate it. Lots of food for thought, that's for sure. If my listeners want to get a hold of you, if they want to find out more about what you do, where can we send them?
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me, MIKKEL. This was an absolute blast and a really engaging conversation. Like, it's a lot of concepts that I talk to other people about, but you bring a very different perspective, which I've really enjoyed today. As far as where people can follow me, really the only social platform I'm on is Twitter, just because I think it's a useful platform. So you can find me there at Seth for Privacy. Very simple. And then as far as everything that I'm working on, like I mentioned at the beginning, I work for Foundation Devices. You can find us and information about what we do and what we're building at foundationdevices.com. And then freedom.tech, which is the publication that I talked about before, which will also have a couple podcasts launching soon, is just freedom.tech. Really simple. But all of those will have other contact info for the companies, other people behind them, that kind of thing.
Amazing. Seth, thank you so much, and I will talk to you soon.